Kyle Busch died on May 21, 2026 at the age of 41, after what was reported as a sudden and severe illness. NASCAR's official profile identifies him as a two-time Cup Series champion, with titles in 2015 and 2019, and 63 Cup Series wins, the most among active drivers at the time of his passing. But when people hear the phrase Kyle Busch leaves behind a fortune, they often think first about money. Contracts, winnings, sponsorships, businesses, cars, homes, trophies, and the commercial empire built around one of the most polarizing names in modern racing. Yet the real weight of that fortune is not only financial, it is emotional, it is historical. It is the kind of legacy that cannot be counted by lawyers, divided by paperwork, or locked inside a bank account. Because Kyle Busch did not simply leave behind wealth. He left behind a wife, Samantha, two children, Brexton and Lennix, a brother who knew the same racing world from the inside, and a fan base that spent years arguing about him, cheering him, booing him, defending him, and finally mourning him. For more than 2 decades, Kyle was not just a driver, he was a disruption. Every generation of NASCAR has its clean heroes, its quiet professionals, its public favorites, and its villains. Kyle Busch somehow became all of those things at once. To some fans, he was the purest racer of his era, a man whose instinct behind the wheel seemed almost unfair, as if he could see openings before they existed. To others, he was arrogant, difficult, too sharp, too unapologetic, too willing to say what others carefully swallowed. But that was the strange power of Kyle Busch. Nobody watched him with indifference. When he entered a race, the emotional temperature changed. Some people wanted him to win because they admired the ruthless precision. Others wanted him to lose because they could not stand the confidence. But both groups were watching. Both groups were reacting. Both groups helped turn him into something larger than a competitor. They turned him into a symbol of what happens when talent refuses to make itself polite. His nickname Rowdy was not just branding. It was a warning label. It told the garage, the grandstands, and every driver in front of him that Kyle Busch was not there to participate in a story. He was there to take control of it. And that is why his death landed with such a strange silence. A man whose life had been surrounded by engine noise, radio chatter, pit road urgency, post-race controversy, and crowd reaction suddenly became the center of a stillness nobody knew how to process. The fortune he left behind may include the visible things, the trophies, the statistics, the records, the business interests, the racing connections, and the money accumulated through years at the highest level of American motorsport. But the fortune that makes people cry is the invisible one. It is the birthday parties he will miss. It is the conversations Samantha will now have to carry without him. It is Brexton growing up with a father's shadow stretching across every karting track, every racing photo, every memory fans want to share. It is Lennix one day learning not only that her father was famous, but that millions of strangers felt something when his name was spoken. That is the painful side of legacy. The bigger it becomes, the harder it is for a family to live beside it. For the public, Kyle Busch becomes a highlight reel, a number, a tribute video, a framed photograph, a throwback paint scheme, a name spoken with reverence by commentators who once criticized him. For his family, he becomes an absence in the house. And no fortune, no matter how large, can soften that completely. Money can protect a family from certain problems, but it cannot replace a voice at the dinner table. It cannot recreate the sound of a father giving advice. It cannot turn old race weekends into new ones. It cannot make children stop looking for someone who is no longer there. That is the cruel contradiction at the center of Kyle Busch's story. He spent his life chasing victory in a sport where every second matters, where hesitation can cost everything, where greatness is measured in speed, aggression, nerve, and control. But in the end, the thing that broke people was not another race, another crash, another rivalry, or another controversial interview. It was the realization that a man who seemed built for motion had suddenly reached the one finish line no competitor can outrun. And now, the fortune he leaves behind becomes a mirror. It reflects his greatness, but it also reflects the price of greatness. It shows the millions earned, but also the weekends sacrificed. It shows the trophies won, but also the private weight carried by the people closest to him. Kyle Busch once made opponents cry by beating them on the track. Now, his legacy makes people cry for a different reason. Because after all the wins, all the noise, all the money, and all the arguments, the final question is not how much he left behind. The final question is how a family learns to live with everything he built, while missing the one person who made it matter. Before Kyle Busch became a fortune, before the contracts, the trophies, the team ownership, the headlines, the boos, the cheers, and the arguments that followed him from track to track, he was simply a boy from Las Vegas who understood speed, before he fully understood the world around it. That is where the emotional weight of his story begins. Not in the bank account, not in the final estimate of his wealth, not in the public image of a NASCAR superstar. It begins with a young racer who found, inside the violence of motion, a language he could control. Kyle did not build his name by being universally loved. He built it by being impossible to ignore. From the beginning, there was something sharp about him, something impatient, something that made people feel he was always racing against more than the car in front of him. He raced as if time itself was an opponent. That instinct carried him from the local circuits into NASCAR's national spotlight, where talent alone was never enough. NASCAR does not just test speed. It tests ego, pressure, patience, survival, politics, sponsorship value, public image, and the ability to remain mentally intact while millions of people judge every move. Kyle Busch entered that world and refused to soften his edges. NASCAR's own record places him among the sport's defining names. A two-time Cup Series champion, winner of the 2015 and 2019 titles, with 63 Cup Series victories and 234 National Series wins across NASCAR's top 3 divisions. But those numbers only tell the clean version of the story. The messier version is what made him unforgettable. Every win seemed to prove his greatness. Every controversy seemed to deepen the divide around him. Every interview, every reaction, every hard move on track became another piece of the Kyle Busch mythology. Some drivers spend their careers trying to become popular. Kyle spent his career becoming inevitable. That inevitability became the foundation of his fortune. The money did not come from one source. It came from years of being marketable because he was dangerous, valuable because he was unpredictable, and bankable because he produced results. Sponsorships followed the performance. Team deals followed the statistics. Merchandise followed the emotion. Fans bought into him, even when they claimed to hate him, because hatred in racing can still be attention, and attention can become power. The more people reacted to Kyle Busch, the more valuable the name became. That is one of the strange truths of American motorsport. A driver does not have to be universally loved to become commercially powerful. He only has to matter. And Kyle mattered every weekend. His estimated net worth has been widely reported around $80 million, while some career earnings estimates place his total racing-related income far higher, though these figures remain estimates rather than official estate disclosures. Yet what makes that fortune dramatic is not simply its size, it is the way it was built. Kyle Busch's wealth was not passive. It was not inherited mythology. It was carved out of risk, repetition, and relentless public exposure. Every dollar carried the echo of a restart, a late race pass, a wreck avoided, a rival angered, a fan converted, a sponsor convinced, a family weekend interrupted. And when he launched Kyle Busch Motorsports, the fortune became more than personal income. It became infrastructure. It became trucks, employees, young drivers, equipment, buildings, manufacturing, and a competitive machine that extended his influence beyond the seat of his own race car. In 2023, Kyle Busch announced the sale of Kyle Busch Motorsports and Rowdy Manufacturing to Spire Motorsports, a move NASCAR described as shifting the ownership landscape in the truck series. To the public, that was business. To people who understand legacy, it was something deeper. It showed that Kyle had already begun turning parts of his racing life into assets that could survive beyond his direct control. He was not just winning races, he was building systems. He was creating a name that could function even when he was not physically behind the wheel. That is why the phrase "leaves behind a fortune" hits differently in his case. A fortune like Kyle Busch's is not just a number that appears beside his name in articles. It is the remains of a life spent converting pressure into value, and for his family that value comes wrapped in grief. Samantha does not inherit only comfort. She inherits the responsibility of protecting a name the public still feels entitled to discuss. Brexton does not inherit only opportunity. He inherits comparison, expectation, and the impossible burden of carrying a famous last name in the same sport that made his father immortal. Lennix does not inherit only security. She inherits a story she will spend years growing into, a story millions of strangers may know before she fully understands it herself. That is the painful architecture of celebrity legacy. The fortune can open doors, but it can also cast a shadow. It can preserve a family's future, but it cannot give them back ordinary days. It can turn a man into a legend, but it can also make his absence public property. Kyle Busch spent his life proving that he could control a race car at the edge of chaos. But the empire he built now enters a different kind of race, one without green flags or checkered flags. The race to protect his memory from exaggeration, to separate the man from the myth, and to help his family carry a fortune that is both a blessing and a wound. The fortune Kyle Busch left behind was never just the product of racing fast. It was the product of being impossible to erase from the conversation. In NASCAR, money follows performance, but true wealth follows attention, and Kyle Busch had both. He had the wins, the championships, the statistics, and the longevity, but he also had something more volatile: emotional gravity. Fans did not simply watch him, they reacted to him, they argued about him. They waited for him to say something sharp, make a risky move, chase down a rival, or turn an ordinary race into another chapter of the Kyle Busch debate. NASCAR's official record places him among the sport's most accomplished drivers, with 2 Cup Series championships, 63 Cup Series wins, and 234 National Series victories across NASCAR's 3 major divisions. But those numbers, as enormous as they are, only explain part of why his name became so valuable. Kyle Busch did not build fortune by being quiet. He built it by becoming a character the sport could not replace. Every major sport has athletes who are loved because they make people comfortable. Kyle was different. He made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort became part of his market power. Sponsors did not invest in him because he was bland. Teams did not build around him because he was easy. Television did not follow him because he disappeared into the background. They followed him because he could win on Sunday and dominate the conversation on Monday. That kind of presence is rare. It can make a driver wealthy, but it can also make him lonely. Because when your public image becomes larger than your private self, people stop asking what it costs you to maintain it. They see the checks, the trophies, the motorhome, the race shop, the brand deals, the merchandise, the victory lanes, and the polished graphics on television. They do not see the pressure of being Kyle Busch every single week. That is why his fortune feels so complicated now. It was built from glory, but also from strain. It was built from race purses and sponsorships, but also from criticism, expectation, travel, risk, and the endless demand to keep proving himself. Kyle was never allowed to simply be talented. He had to be dominant. He had to be entertaining. He had to be controversial enough to remain interesting, but controlled enough to remain valuable. That balance can make a man rich, but it can also trap him inside a role he created before he fully understood how long he would have to play it. Rowdy was a nickname, but over time it became a business identity. It sold shirts, it shaped reactions. It turned boos into branding and criticism into visibility. The same edge that made some fans reject him also made others defend him with even more loyalty. That is how a racing career becomes an empire, not by pleasing everyone, but by making everyone feel something. And Kyle understood the business of racing better than many people gave him credit for. His career was not only about driving someone else's car. He became a team owner, a builder, a talent developer, and a businessman. Kyle Busch Motorsports became one of the most important organizations in the truck series, a place connected to young drivers, future stars, and the broader machinery of NASCAR development. When Kyle Busch Motorsports and Rowdy Manufacturing were sold to Spire Motorsports in 2023, NASCAR described it as a major shift in the Truck Series ownership landscape. That sale matters because it shows how Kyle's fortune was not only personal, it had become structural. He had created assets, facilities, relationships, and opportunities that extended beyond his own hands on the steering wheel. He was no longer just the man inside the number 8 car. He was a name attached to buildings, equipment, jobs, careers, and memories. But this is where the emotional turn becomes unavoidable. When a man like Kyle Busch leaves behind wealth, he also leaves behind unfinished responsibility. The public may look at the fortune and imagine comfort. They may assume that money makes grief easier, that a large estate somehow softens the blow. But for a family, the opposite can be true. A fortune can become a room full of reminders. Every asset has a story. Every trophy has a date. Every business decision carries his fingerprint. Every racing photo becomes both proof of greatness and evidence of absence. Samantha is not just left with financial security. She is left with the burden of guarding the human being behind a public name. Brexton is not simply left with a famous father's legacy. He is left with a road that millions of people may expect him to follow. Lennix is not simply left with protection. She is left with a father whose legend may reach her before her own memories do. That is why the fortune makes people cry. Not because it is large, but because it is powerless in the one way that matters most. It can preserve a lifestyle, but it cannot preserve a heartbeat. It can secure a future, but it cannot restore an ordinary morning. It can protect children from financial fear, but it cannot answer the questions children ask when they are old enough to understand what death has taken. Kyle Busch's estate may contain wealth, property, business value, and memorabilia, but the real inheritance is heavier. His family inherits the noise of the crowd, the love of loyal fans, the judgment of critics, the pressure of a famous surname, and the impossible task of separating Kyle the legend from Kyle the husband and father. In the end, Kyle Busch's fortune was built the same way he raced, aggressively, relentlessly, and without asking permission. But after his passing, that fortune changes shape. It stops being a symbol of success alone and becomes a map of everything he touched. The money tells one story. The trophies tell another. The public tributes tell another. But inside the family, the story is quieter and far more painful. A man won almost everything a racer could win, built more than most drivers ever build, and still left behind a space no victory could fill. Behind every public fortune is a private family, forced to live with the parts the audience never sees. In Kyle Busch's case, that private world had names: Samantha, Brexton, and Lennix. They were not side characters in the Kyle Busch story. They were the emotional center of it. The people who knew the difference between Kyle Busch the NASCAR villain, Kyle Busch the champion, Kyle Busch the businessman, and Kyle Busch the man who came home when the cameras stopped rolling. To the public, Kyle was Rowdy, the driver who could turn a Sunday afternoon into a battlefield. To his family, he was a husband and father whose life was measured not only by lap times, but by school moments, family photos, travel days, quiet conversations, and the ordinary tenderness that never fit neatly into a race broadcast. Reports after his passing noted that he was survived by his wife, Samantha, their son Brexton, and their daughter Lennix, a detail that changed the way many fans understood the loss. This was not only the end of a racing career, but the breaking open of a young family's future. That is why the fortune he left behind feels so painful. Wealth can make headlines, but family gives those headlines meaning. Without Samantha, Brexton, and Lennix, the story would be about a champion's estate. With them, it becomes about inheritance in its deepest form. Samantha does not simply inherit assets, memories, and public sympathy. She inherits the complicated responsibility of protecting Kyle's humanity from the machine of legacy. The racing world will remember him through numbers, highlight reels, arguments, victories, rivalries, and tributes. But a wife remembers what the sport does not record. She remembers the weight of the travel schedule, the emotional calm-down after a bad race, the silence after criticism, the fatigue hidden behind confidence, the private relief after survival, and the small domestic moments that never made the broadcast. For years, Samantha lived beside a man whose profession demanded that he be fearless in public, That kind of life asks something of a family. It asks them to share him with fans, sponsors, teams, and critics. It asks them to accept that their private life will always be connected to public performance. And after his passing, it asks them to grieve, while millions of strangers feel they own a piece of the story. Brexton's position is even more emotionally complex. He is not just the son of Kyle Busch. He is a child growing up in the long shadow of a racing dynasty. Every time his name is mentioned beside racing, people will see his father first. That can be a gift, but it can also be a burden. A famous surname can open doors, but it can also fill those doors with expectation. For Brexton, the fortune left behind is not only financial security. It is a road paved before he is old enough to decide how much of it he wants to walk. Fans may look at him and imagine the next chapter. They may see a helmet, a cart, a future stock car, maybe even the No. 8 waiting somewhere in the mythology of NASCAR. But a child is not a sequel. A son is not a continuation project. Brexton deserves to become himself, even if the world keeps looking for pieces of Kyle in his eyes, his posture, his competitive instinct, and every turn he takes on a track. That is one of the cruelest sides of legacy. The public often calls it honor, while the person carrying it feels the weight. Then there is Lennix, whose inheritance may be the hardest to explain. She will grow up with a father whose name is everywhere, but whose presence can no longer grow beside her. For her, Kyle Busch may first appear as photos, videos, stories, trophies, clips, interviews, and memories told by others. She will hear that he was fierce, brilliant, controversial, funny, difficult, talented, relentless, loved, criticized, and unforgettable. But one day, she may ask the question, fortunate answer. What was he like when he was just dad? That is where money stops being powerful. It can preserve archives. It can maintain a home. It can protect children's education. It can provide stability. But it cannot recreate the ordinary accumulation of moments that makes a parent real to a child. The voice in the hallway, the hand on the shoulder, the advice given badly but lovingly, the shared joke, the look across a room, the comfort of knowing why someone is there without needing to explain why that matters. After Kyle's death, the NASCAR community paid tribute in ways that showed how deeply his presence had shaped the sport. Reports described emotional scenes at Charlotte, with Samantha and the children present as the racing world honored him, including gestures from drivers and teams that recognized both the competitor and the family left behind. But public tribute is a strange thing. It can be beautiful and painful at the same time. It tells a family they are not alone, yet it also forces them to stand inside the visibility of their grief. The crowd mourns loudly, then eventually goes home. The broadcast ends. The schedule moves on. The next race begins. But the family remains inside the quiet aftermath. That is the part of Kyle Busch's fortune that hurts the most. He left behind success large enough to fill museums, broadcasts, and tribute packages. But his family must live with the empty spaces between those symbols. Samantha must protect the man behind the myth. Brexton must grow without being swallowed by comparison. Lennix must one day understand a father whose legend arrived before her memories. And NASCAR must face the fact that one of its loudest, fiercest, most unforgettable figures left behind a fortune that cannot be measured only in dollars, because the most valuable part of Kyle Busch's life was never the money. It was the people who now have to carry his name without him. When people talk about the fortune Kyle Busch left behind, they usually imagine something simple, a number. They want to know the net worth, the properties, the contracts, the race winnings, the business value, the cars, the trophies, and the legal structure of the estate. But a life like Kyle Busch's cannot be reduced that easily. His fortune was not sitting in one place, waiting to be counted. It was spread across decades of racing, sponsorships, public identity, team ownership, merchandise, investments, intellectual property, and the emotional value of a name that NASCAR fans could recognize instantly. Kyle Busch was not only a driver who won races, he was a commercial force, he was a brand, he was rowdy. And after his death, that brand became something more complicated than money. It became memory. NASCAR's official record describes him as a two-time Cup Series champion, winner of the 2015 and 2019 titles, with 63 Cup Series wins and 234 National Series victories across NASCAR's top 3 divisions. That kind of resume creates wealth in ways the public does not always see. A race purse is only one layer. Sponsorship is another. Merchandise is another. Appearance value is another. Licensing is another. Team relationships are another. The deeper a driver becomes embedded in a sport, the more his name begins to function like an asset. Kyle Busch's name could sell hats, shirts, die-cast cars, race tickets, video packages, documentaries, tribute broadcasts, and nostalgia. Fans who loved him bought into him. Fans who disliked him still helped make him valuable by refusing to ignore him. In sports business, emotional reaction is currency. Kyle understood that, even if he did not always present himself like a polished corporate figure. In fact, part of his commercial power came from the opposite. He felt real. He felt sharp. He felt unscripted. He could be difficult, but difficulty made him memorable. That is why his fortune was never just about what he earned. It was about the identity he built around earning it. One of the clearest examples of that identity becoming a business was Kyle Busch Motorsport. For years, KBM was not just a side project, it was an extension of Kyle's competitive philosophy. It carried his standards, his aggression, his eye for talent, and his belief that racing was not only something you did behind the wheel. It was something you built in the shop, in the equipment, in the people, and in the culture around the team. In 2023, Kyle sold Kyle Busch Motorsports and Rowdy Manufacturing to Spire Motorsports, a move NASCAR described as a major shift in the Truck Series ownership landscape. That sale matters because it shows that part of his fortune had already been transformed from active competition into transferable business value. Trucks, equipment, facilities, manufacturing capability, relationships, and organizational reputation had all become part of the larger Kyle Busch machine. But even after a sale like that, the emotional ownership does not disappear. Fans still connect KBM to Kyle. Young drivers who pass through the system still carry part of his influence. Employees, competitors, and industry insiders still remember the standards he set. That is the kind of asset no contract can fully transfer. A buyer can purchase equipment. A company can acquire facilities. A team can take over operations. But no one can truly buy the aura of the person who made the name matter. That aura is now part of what his family inherits. Samantha, Brexton, and Lennix are not just connected to money. They are connected to an entire public mythology, and mythology is harder to manage than wealth. This is where the idea of a fortune becomes emotionally dangerous. Outsiders may assume a large estate means comfort, closure, and security. But a fortune connected to fame often comes with pressure. There are decisions about memorabilia, public statements, tribute partnerships, charitable causes, licensing, family privacy, and the future use of a name. There are questions about what to preserve, what to release, what to protect, and what to let go. Every decision can feel heavier because the public is watching. If Samantha speaks, people analyze her grief. If she stays quiet, people speculate. If Brexton continues racing, people compare him to his father. If he steps away, people may wonder why. If Lennix grows up outside the racing spotlight, fans may still feel attached to her because they feel attached to Kyle. That is not normal inheritance. That is legacy management under emotional surveillance. And that may be the part most viewers never understand. Kyle Busch's fortune can support his family, but it can also keep their grief visible. His trophies will not simply sit quietly on a shelf. They will tell a story every time someone looks at them. His race suits, helmets, fire suits, cars, and photographs are not ordinary possessions. They are artifacts. They carry public meaning. They are pieces of NASCAR history. But inside the family, they are also pieces of a husband and father. One person's museum item is another person's heartbreak. One fan's treasured memory is a child's reminder of what can never return. So yes, Kyle Busch left behind a fortune. But the most important part of that fortune is not the number people search online. It is the weight attached to the name. It is the empire built from speed, conflict, charisma, and victory. It is the brand that kept moving even when the man became exhausted. It is the business legacy that outgrew the garage. It is the emotional inheritance now carried by the people who loved him before the world turned him into a headline. Money can be counted, assets can be appraised, contracts can be reviewed, but the true Kyle Busch fortune is larger and sadder than all of that. It is the story of a man who built so much that even after he was gone, his family was left surrounded by proof of how deeply he had mattered. The reason Kyle Busch's story cuts so deeply is not simply that he left behind wealth. Wealth alone does not make a nation of racing fans stop, look back, and feel the strange ache of unfinished history. What makes his legacy so heavy is that Kyle Busch was still part of the living argument of NASCAR when he was suddenly gone. He was not an old champion quietly remembered from a distant era. He was still connected to the present, still part of the sport's rhythm, still a name that could change the atmosphere of a race weekend. NASCAR's own record describes him as a two-time Cup champion, with 63 Cup Series wins and 234 National Series victories across its three major divisions. While NASCAR also documented the wide reaction from the motorsports community after his passing. But records alone do not explain the pain. Records show what he achieved. They do not show what his absence interrupts. Kyle Busch belonged to that rare category of athlete whose career became a permanent debate. For some fans, he was one of the purest racers NASCAR had ever produced, a driver with the instinct, aggression, and car control to make impossible moves look brutally simple. For others, he represented everything they disliked: arrogance, temper, impatience, and a refusal to package himself into something soft and easy to consume. But that division was part of the legacy. Kyle did not need universal approval to become unforgettable. In fact, his greatness was sharpened by resistance. Every boo confirmed that he mattered. Every cheer confirmed that he had built loyalty. Every argument about him proved that he occupied space in the sport that no ordinary driver could fill. That is why his fortune feels almost secondary now. Money can tell us that Kyle Busch succeeded. His legacy tells us that he disturbed the emotional order of NASCAR. He forced people to react. He made fans question what they really wanted from a champion. Did they want politeness, or did they want ruthlessness? Did they want a clean public image, or did they want a racer who seemed almost allergic to pretending? Did they want a driver who said the right things, or one who made every restart feel like a threat? Kyle's career exposed a truth that many sports try to hide. Fans often say they want humility, but they remember fire. They say they want calm professionalism, but they come alive when someone refuses to behave like everyone else. And that is what Kyle gave them. Fire. Not always comfortable fire. Not always pretty fire. But fire that made the sport feel alive. He brought tension into rooms before he even spoke. He made rivals sharper because beating him meant something. He made victories feel earned because nobody could say he lacked talent. Even his critics had to respect the numbers. They could dislike the attitude, question the decisions, complain about the interviews, or resent the way he seemed to thrive on being the villain. But they could not erase the trophies. They could not erase the championships. They could not erase the fact that when Kyle Busch was at his best, he looked like a man operating on a different racing frequency. The tragedy is that people often understand a figure like Kyle too late. While he is active, they reduce him to the role he plays. The villain, the hothead, the genius, the problem, the champion, the rich driver, the arrogant star, the businessman, the father of Brexton, the husband of Samantha, the owner of Rowdy. But when he is gone, all those labels collapse into something more human. Suddenly, the same fans who once booed him remember how much energy he brought into the sport. The same critics who complained about his edge begin to understand that the edge was part of what made Sundays unpredictable. The same people who wanted someone else to win realized that Kyle Busch gave their favorite drivers a measuring stick. He was the opponent who made victory feel bigger. That is why his family inherits something much heavier than money. They inherit the private version of a public storm. Samantha, Brexton, and Lennix must live with a legacy that belongs emotionally to millions, but personally to them. The public will remember Kyle through championship banners, race clips, tribute graphics, die-cast cars, old interviews, and debates about where he ranks among NASCAR's greatest. His family will remember him through rooms, routines, birthdays, habits, unfinished conversations, and the silence that follows when a person who once filled a home with presence is no longer there. That difference matters. The public mourns the driver. The family mourns the man. And for Brextons especially, the legacy may become both gift and burden. Racing fans will watch him with impossible curiosity. They will search for Kyle in his movements, his temper, his confidence, his results. They may call it support. But support can become pressure when it is filtered through a famous name. Being the son of Kyle Busch means growing up with doors open, but also with shadows waiting behind those doors. It means every achievement may be compared to a legend, and every struggle may be measured against a standard no child should have to carry. That is the cost of inheriting not just wealth, but mythology. Kyle Busch's fortune may secure the future, but his legacy complicates it. The money can be managed, the assets can be organized, the brand can be protected, but the meaning of Kyle Busch will keep moving, because legends do not stay still. Fans will reinterpret him. Rivals will remember him differently with time. Younger viewers will discover him through highlights and wonder why the crowd reacted so loudly. Older fans will argue about whether he was misunderstood, underappreciated, too abrasive, or exactly what NASCAR needed. And maybe that is why the story hurts. Kyle Busch left behind a fortune, but the fortune is not the most valuable thing. The most valuable thing is the emotional proof that he mattered. He made the sport louder. He made winning harder. He made fans choose sides. He built a name that could survive beyond the garage, beyond the trophies, beyond the noise. But survival is not the same as presence. His legacy remains powerful and impossible to ignore. His family remains, carrying the part of him no camera ever fully captured. And NASCAR remains, forced to continue without one of the men who made its modern era feel dangerous, personal, and alive. In the end, the story of Kyle Busch's fortune is not really about how much money he left behind. It is about what money cannot do when a life ends too soon. NASCAR's official record identifies Busch as a two-time Cup Series champion, winner of the 2015 and 2019 titles, with 63 Cup Series wins and 234 National Series victories across NASCAR's top three divisions. After his passing on May 21, 2026, that record became not only a resume, but a permanent monument to a career that had shaped an entire generation of racing. Yet a monument is not the same as a man. A trophy case can shine under perfect light, but it cannot speak at the dinner table. A bank account can protect a family from financial fear, but it cannot bring back the sound of a father walking through the door. A racing legacy can make strangers cry in grandstands across America, but it cannot privately comfort Samantha, Brexton, and Lennix in the moments when the world becomes quiet and the cameras are gone. That is the hard truth behind this whole story. Kyle Busch spent his life proving that he could win almost anything placed in front of him. He beat rivals, expectations, criticism, pressure, bad weekends, angry crowds, and the brutal mathematics of a sport where one mistake can erase everything. But the one thing no racer can beat is time. And when time finally stopped for Kyle, everything he had built suddenly changed meaning. The fortune became evidence. The trophies became memories. The cars became artifacts. The old interviews became echoes. The highlight reels became something painful to watch, because every clip showed movement, life, confidence, fire, and a man who seemed too full of momentum to ever become past tense. That is why his family's grief feels so different from the public's grief. Fans can return to the videos whenever they want. They can replay the wins, argue about the rankings, revisit the controversies, and decide where Kyle belongs among NASCAR's greatest. But his family cannot replay ordinary life. They cannot replay a quiet breakfast exactly as it was. They cannot pause a birthday and bring him back into the room. They cannot turn a race weekend into another memory waiting to happen. For the public, Kyle Busch becomes a legend. For his family, he becomes someone missing from every future day. And maybe that is why this fortune makes people cry. Not because it is tragic to leave behind wealth, but because it is tragic to leave behind so much life unfinished. Samantha must now protect a name that belongs to history, but also belongs to her heart. She must decide when to speak, when to stay silent, when to let the world remember him, and when to keep parts of him only for the family. Brexton must grow up with a father whose shadow will follow him everywhere racing exists. If he wins, people will say he has Kyle's blood. If he struggles, people will measure him against Kyle's greatness. If he chooses another path, people may wonder why. That is not a normal childhood inheritance. That is a public legacy wrapped around a private wound. And Lennix, still so young, will inherit a father through stories, photographs, voices, and the memories others preserved for her. One day, she may understand that millions knew his name, but she may also feel the ache of wanting to know the parts of him no camera captured. That is where all the money in the world loses its power. It can create safety, but not presence. It can preserve the name, but not the touch. It can build a future, but not restore the person who was supposed to stand inside it. Kyle Busch's life was built around noise, engines, crowds, pit calls, rivals, interviews, celebrations, booze, and victory lane. But his ending leaves behind silence, and inside that silence, the real size of his legacy becomes clear. He was not loved by everyone, and maybe he never needed to be. He was respected because he mattered. He was criticized because he mattered. He was booed because he mattered. He was defended because he mattered. And now he is mourned because beneath all the conflict, NASCAR knows it lost someone who made the sport feel sharper, louder, less predictable, and more alive. The fortune he leaves behind will be counted by others. The estate will be organized. The assets will be handled. The brand will survive. The numbers will remain in record books. But the deeper inheritance is not financial. It is emotional. It is the burden and privilege of carrying the name Kyle Busch into a future he no longer gets to shape himself. And that is the final heartbreak. A man can win championships, build businesses, create wealth, raise a family, divide fans, terrify rivals, and become a legend. But when he is gone, the world does not ask how much he owned. It asks who is left holding the pieces. For Kyle Busch, the answer is painful. A family surrounded by proof of his greatness, a sport still trying to understand the silence he left behind, and a legacy so large that even a fortune cannot make it feel whole.